Welcome back to WCHS, ladies and gentlemen. I actually don't know why I have the headphones on, because I think I'm using that audio. I just like the look, maybe. It's a good look. Our last lesson, lesson 16, was looking at the foundation of the contemporary world, the foundation of contemporary globalization, and within that, we're looking at the roles of the IMF and World Bank. And just as a conclusion to that, just reapproaching that, we saw that some people are critical of the IMF and World Bank. And you might be saying, like, why? Why would they be critical? I thought the World Bank is helping. At first they help rebuild war-torn countries, and today the World Bank is helping build the less and least developed countries of the world. How is there possibly room for criticism there? Well, in order to explore the criticism surrounding the IMF and World Bank, and to transition into today's topic of transnationals, we're going to go to Bolivia. Anybody here been to Bolivia? I thought your hand was going up, and I was pretty impressed by that. Like, wow, tell me more about Bolivia. Well, we're going to go to Bolivia, and we're going to go to a city called Kuchabumba. And Kuchabumba was a city created in 1571. Just knew that. 1571. So it has some buildings from the 16th century. So it has some really amazing architecture. Gorgeous city. Do go to Kuchabumba, right? But if you have an old city like that, what is likely is that some of their infrastructure falls into disrepair and they need to reinvest in it. So in the late 1990s, the city of Kuchabumba realizes that they have an issue with sanitation, that they need to update their sewage system, and they don't have the money. The country of Bolivia doesn't have the money. The city of Kuchabumba doesn't have the money. So they go to the IMF and they ask for some loans. And the IMF says, sure, but there's a condition. So why are some people critical of the IMF and World Bank? Because of the conditions that the IMF and World Bank may impose in order to qualify for the help from the World Bank and the IMF. So the condition that was imposed upon Kuchabumba was the IMF wanted the Bolivians to become more capitalist. They wanted, because in essence, what was discussed at Bretton Woods was, how to create a global capitalist market, right? So it makes sense that the IMF, the World Bank, if their goal is to promote capitalism, it makes sense that if there's a country asking for their aid that is more socialist than the IMF and World Bank would like, then they're going to put some demands, some conditions upon that loan. And so they say to Kuchabumba, you need to privatize some of your public services. So they privatize things like the transportation system, but they also sell the public utility that is water. They privatize it. They privatize the water services in Kuchabumba. They sell it to an American company from San Francisco called Bechtel. And Bechtel isn't generally in the water business. Generally, they're in the construction and engineering business. But they see an opportunity here to make money. Because now the way that the lawyers from Bechtel write up the contract, not only do they control the sanitation utility in Kuchabumba, but they own the water. They own all the water, even that which rains from the sky. So can you own the rain? In Kuchabumba in 1999, the answer is yes. The way that it was drafted, the way that the lawyers wrote it up, Bechtel now owned the rain. So it became illegal in Kuchabumba for the people to collect rainwater. And you might be saying, well, who collects rainwater, right? Water's not that expensive. I appreciate that you do, because that's really earth-friendly. But water's not that expensive. Well, once Bechtel had a monopoly on water in Kuchabumba, guess what they did with the cost of water, the price of water? It went up. It at least doubled maybe even as much as quadrupled. So what did that mean for the average person in Kuchabumba? That meant that 20 to 25% of their family income was being spent on water. So the increased cost of water drove a lot of families into desperation, into poverty. And going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, water's at the bottom, right? It's one of our most immediate needs. You have air, then you have water. It's our second most immediate need. And now you have a corporation that's saying, more important than ensuring that your needs are met is that our profit is being met, our need for profit. So the people protest, and while the people protest, the government comes to break up the protests. So it appears that the government's on the side of the corporation. So the Bolivian government, the Kuchabumban government, instead of coming to protect the people from the predatorial interests of Bechtel, they come and they try to break up the protest. And this will lead to something called the Kuchabumba Water Wars. Now, it's not often that you hear of a water war. You know, we have water fights. Sometimes that's a fun June activity. But this is a water war with casualties. And some of the casualties will be roughly your age. Children caught in the protests, killed by police that are protecting the interests of Bechtel against the people of Bolivia. The government is protecting transnational interests ahead of the interests of those who they are elected to represent. This is an example of why some people look at the IMF and World Bank and they're very critical. Because they may suggest that the IMF and World Bank, they're furthering the agenda or the interests of corporations and of Americans and transnationals at the expense of the locals. And it seems to provide clear evidence that they're right in this case. So why are people opposed to the IMF today? Some people are opposed to the IMF today because of the conditions put upon their service. What kind of conditions? Well, it's the agenda of the IMF and World Bank to see more free trade, more capitalism globally. So to promote that, they may put a condition that those wanting the loans, they have to privatize. What's the cost of that? Well, in Bolivia, in Kuchabumba, it meant that the cost of water became so high that many couldn't afford it. And it did lead to casualties. 6 deaths, more than 20 people arrested. Now the water has been renegotiated. Bechtel doesn't own the water in Kuchabumba anymore. It was bad for their public image, obviously, but for those months in November and the beginning of 2000, this was really a struggle between local and transnational interests. So that's a look back to the last lesson as we look ahead to our lesson today. So the first part of our lesson today is define transnational corporations. And you might be saying, you know what, this is going to take like a minute. You'd be wrong. This is going to take a little while. The first step in defining transnational corporation, we need to define corporation. So what is a corporation? My period 2 class offered this. Corporation is by definition bigger than a company. And I'm like, not always. It doesn't have to be. I actually own a corporation. I'm one of 2 owners. And it is much smaller than most companies. So corporations don't always have to be defined by size. That's not what defines it. So what defines a corporation? Limited liability. That's what defines a corporation. Limited liability. That's the benefit of incorporating. So if Russ McBride owns McBride's Pub in Millet, you know, right next to Leanne's, we're going to create a little pub district in Millet, entertainment hub of central Alberta. If McBride's Pub is there and I'm the sole proprietor, I'm the owner, then if somebody stumbles on a beer bottle and it seriously hurts themselves, I can be personally sued because that's my company. I'm a sole proprietor. I could literally lose my home if I don't have insurance to cover that. But if it's a corporation, my liability is limited. Let's look at the corporation that is Tesla so that we can look at what I mean by that. Tesla is a corporation that you're familiar with, and the stock has exploded in the last month. It's gone up by almost 50%. So it's doing very well. Hopefully you bought some stock in Tesla, especially at a time, and we've talked about this, especially at a time when your bank account, your savings is offering you maybe 1% or less. Then when you can see stocks like this that in the last 6 months are up by 50%, in the last day it's up by 3%, you can see why people might want to get involved in owning a part of a corporation. And we'll return back to that. But back to the concept of limited liability. Let's say I own one share, just one share of Tesla. How many shares are there? Well, Tesla is recognized as a $1 trillion corporation now. So I'm going to guess that there's millions of shares. But let's say I own one share. What is my liability in that company limited to? Anybody want to wager a guess? Let's say I bought the share for $1,000, yesterday or 2 days ago. What is my liability in that company limited to? How much can I lose if they get sued? Tesla cars are electric cars. Sometimes they start on fire. And when they start on fire, people might sue because it's very dangerous. So how much is my liability limited to in Tesla if they get sued? Can I lose my home? I have one share. What's my liability limited to? Anybody want to guess? Yes. $1,000. How much I invested into Tesla. So the concept of limited liability with corporations is that it limits your exposure. Limits your exposure. So McBride's Pub, I'm the sole proprietor. Somebody falls, I have no insurance. I could lose my home when I get sued. Tesla, I bought one share. The company could become worthless, and then I'm out $1,000. So the advantage of incorporating is limited liability. So one of the definable characteristics of a corporation, limited liability.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Do you need somebody? Because we are recording. Okay. You said Haley?
Not me.
No. She went down to see you.
She's coming back.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so that's fun. What's another definition of a corporation? Well, historically, corporations were created with a limited mandate. A limited mandate. Some of the oldest corporations, Hudson Bay Company, it's a mercantilistic corporation. Its mandate was limited to the areas of Canada where the rivers flowed into the Hudson Bay. British East India Company, limited mandate. They had an area of the world where they could practice commerce. If you go to America, and the story of corporations in America, the story of America and the story of corporations, it's really one story, right? The golden age of America and the golden age of American corporations, it's an intertwined story. So where do American corporations get their story from? The River Charleston. I want to tell you the story of the River Charleston. River Charleston in West Virginia. It's a beautiful river, but they didn't have a bridge. The people of Charleston wanted a bridge across the River Charleston, and the municipality didn't have the money for it. So they decided to create a corporation with the mandate to build a bridge. And when the corporation built the bridge, then the corporation had to cease to exist. That's the birth of a corporation in America. They had a limited mandate that the public said, this is what you can do to serve the community. Once you've done that, you're done. So the goal of the corporation was very specific, and it had to serve the community. But we've seen an evolution in that. Most corporations don't serve the community. Here locally, Manluck serves their community. You know, they help build the pool, they help finish the park at Sacred Heart. Manluck is a pillar of our community. They are a citizen in Wetaskiwin. Not all corporations are like that. Most corporations, they're not there for a limited mandate. Their purpose will unlock in a few moments. But historically, it was a limited mandate. Build the bridge, and then cease to exist. But then what happened in the 19th century was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. And what those amendments tried to do was eliminate limits put upon people's lives, specifically slavery. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that's how America abolished slavery. They said, we cannot limit the lives of people. Well, corporate lawyers are brilliant. We already saw that with the Bechtel thing. So corporate lawyers are saying, well, legally, corporations are people. And we're like, how's that? Well, legally, corporations can be sued, and they can sue. So in the eyes of the law, corporations are people. And then it was concluded, you're right, corporations are legally people. They're entities that can sue and be sued in a court of law. So if corporations are people, and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment says no one can limit the lives or the business, right, the economic lives of people, then you can no longer say to corporations that they have to cease to exist once their limited mandate has been placed upon them, or fulfilled, and the Supreme Court decided, you're right. So now we have corporations that are immortal. Walt Disney died. Disney is immortal. It is still alive. It's a corporation that has outlasted its founder, as many will. So what we saw was, what are corporations? Originally, they were there to fulfill a public service, to fulfill a very specific mandate. Build a bridge over the River Charleston. No one in the community has enough money, so we're going to incorporate that. We're going to have individual people grab some shares. They're going to invest in it. We're going to build a bridge. The bridge is going to help everybody in town. But then once the bridge is built, that corporation has to cease to exist. But then they manipulated the outcome of the Civil War and the freedom of slaves to say, you are limiting the lives of corporations. Our economic activities are being limited, and our lifespan's being limited. And that's illegal. And constitutionally, they were right. So now we have immortal corporations. So what are corporations? Limited liability. First had to serve the public, but now they're immortal. So now we got to answer our question, if they're not serving the public's interest, whose interest are they serving? Let's go back to Tesla for a second. Russ McBride buys one share in Tesla. Why? What do I expect to get from that? Why does anyone buy a share in Tesla? To get richer. They want to see this, right? They want to see that share go from $400 a year ago to over $1,000 today. That's a 250% return, or 147% return. I don't know why my math is so bad. Really? 400? Anywho, it's gone up a lot in the last 12 months. That's profit. So the primary goal of a corporation, the next defining characteristic, is profit. They're profit-seeking, generating creation of man, right? Just like government, corporations don't exist in nature. We created them. So we have this idea of limited liability. Now they're immortal. They can sue and be sued, but in terms of being sued, my liability is limited, and they're meant to create a profit. Now, we've already talked about how some corporations like Manluck are good. Some corporations might be seen as bad. You know, Mr. Hetlinger has, criticized me for wearing Nike clothing because Nike is associated with sweatshops and exploitation. So we've often seen the story that corporations are instruments of evil. We have also seen the story that they can be instruments of good. Either way, they are designed to create a profit. accept. There's one type of corporation that might say, you know what, we're going to purposely run at a loss. Would you buy shares in that? No. So it's probably not a private corporation, right? It's probably not one that is owned by individuals, that is, traded on a stock exchange. Why would somebody buy shares into a company that is saying we are purposely running at a loss? But there are corporations in Canada. There's a corporation that exists within Wetaskiwin that purposely runs at a loss. Sometimes crown corporations. Crown corporations in Canada are owned by the government. Sometimes crown corporations will purposely run at a loss. Now, you're sitting in a desk in a public company, right? Wetaskiwin Regional Public Schools. We are not a private company. This isn't a private school. It is a public school. Sometimes we do have a loss, but we don't try to lose money. We just do. We don't try to do it. We just do it. I just got fired right there. No, we often don't lose money, right? There are years, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's probably years where our budget is balanced. But there are corporations in our community, crown corporations, that purposely run at a loss. My example for you is what? Can you think of a crown corporation, a federal one that is Canada-wide, and that because of its presence, its national presence, there's services that it provides that they lose money on that service. But they do it because it's not just about that company making money or that corporation. This corporation unites Canada. So the goal of uniting Canada is more important than the goal of this corporation making money. Yes? Railroads would be a good example. My friend, railroads at one time were, public property. But the railroads have been privatized, and since they've been privatized, they have become quite profitable. So the Canadian National Railway, CN, has been one of the hot stocks of the last year in Canada, and will continue to do so, especially when we don't have pipelines to push our oil. If we got to do it on rail, then rail is making money. So there have been times in the past that the CN has lost money, and you're right, that would make a great example, because they're like, we're purposely going to charge less to move products around, because that's going to stimulate the economy. And we call that practice counter-cyclical. Counter-cyclical would be, right now in Canada, maybe we have a recession. The economy's shrinking. How can we encourage people to become more enterprising? Well, let's reduce the cost of business. How do you do that? The CN, if it was national, could run at a loss. We will ship your product for you for less than it should cost. So that's an example of a counter-cyclical practice, purposely running at a loss, if the CN was national, and it had been national. And many companies have national airlines. Air Canada at one time was a national airline, and they might run at a loss because they want people to be able to travel around Canada. Many countries around the world have a national airline, and quite a few of them run at a loss, purposely so that they can unite the people. But let's assume that Air Canada and CN not nationalized. There's still a company here in town, federal company, public company, crown corporation, running at a loss because what they do is more important than the cost that they charge for it. They still charge us for it, but what they're charging us is a fraction of how much it costs them to do it. So it's uniting Wetaskiwin to none of it, right? Let's say you have a grandma in none of it, and you live here in Wetaskiwin, and she's made you some cookies, and she wants you to enjoy these cookies at Christmas time. She's going to ship them to you. And there's private companies that ship stuff, and there's a public company that ships stuff, and the public company is Canada Post. Canada Post runs at a loss. They are losing billions of dollars. They could charge more for what they do, but then less people would use it and Canada would be less connected. Sorry? You know, that's that's an observation that maybe they're not the best at what they do. And there are times that the private companies might actually be cheaper. But in general, sending a letter from here, Wetaskiwin, into Edmonton costs the same stamp as it would send to a Cowlitz. But it costs a lot more to ship that letter up there. So that's an example of purposely running at a loss. So let's go back to the thing. We have corporations. What are corporations? Limited liability. At first had a limited mandate, but became immortal. Private corporations seek a profit. Crown corporations generally seek a profit, but they also might be counter-cyclical and purposely run at a loss to help be a catalyst of growth in the economy. Do we generally understand corporations? The next part is, what does it mean to be a transnational? A national corporation is clear. It's a company that is just in Canada. National corporation. Multinational means many countries. Here's a company that does business in many countries. So sometimes people get the word multinational and transnational confused because are transnationals multinationals? Yes. All transnationals are multinationals, but not all multinationals are transnational. There's something different about a transnational. Yes?
I think transnational corporations have the profit goes back to one country and the products that they make go back to one country.
That might be the case, but it's not the case for all, and it's not the defining characteristic. I want to talk to you about Tim Hortons. Tim Horton was a hockey player for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He unfortunately passes away. There's a restaurant named after him, family business. They sell donuts and coffee. Maybe you've heard of it, called Tim Hortons. When people think of Canada, they often think of Tim Hortons. But Tim Hortons is actually a transnational. So Tim Hortons, fast food restaurant, we think it's Canada. But the definition of transnational is it becomes blurry. Trans is blurry. You look at Tim Hortons, and the more you learn about them, the more you're like, well, what are you? Are you Canadian? Are you American? Okay, you're from Hamilton, you're founded in Canada, you do business in Bahrain and Oman and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the UAE and all these other places, and you're like, well, this makes you a multinational. How is it a transnational? Well, they've been connected to other companies in the past, like Burger King. So at times they've been connected to Burger King and Wendy's, and sometimes they own other companies, sometimes they're owned by other companies. Currently, they're a subsidiary owned by a bigger company. So they're a corporation owned by a bigger company called Restaurant Brands International. So we look into that and you're like, oh, well, it's worldwide, but their headquarters are in Toronto. So doesn't that still mean it's Canadian? Well, when you look into that, it's an affiliate of a Brazilian investment company, 3G Capital, which owns 30%, 32% of that. So in essence, you could look into it and say, is this Brazilian then? Is Tim Hortons a Brazilian company? Their headquarters are in Rio and New York. Is that an American company then again? Is it Canadian? Because there's so many layers to what is Tim Hortons, it's blurry. It's a transnational. And their product isn't Canadian. Their beans come from this country. Some of their other stuff comes from this other country. It's a global country. There's a blurring of where it comes from. Transnational. So we can have corporations that are transnational, but we can also have people that are transnational. So although I might own one share of Tesla, this guy owns a lot. He owns enough that his net wealth has gone up by something like 46 billion in the last 2 weeks. So yesterday I made the claim that he's worth more than all of our families combined. And I could also just make the claim that he's made more in the last 2 weeks than all of our families will make combined, not today or this year, but in our lifetimes. This guy is incredibly wealthy. But in my mind, he's also a transnational. Because when I look at him, I see a guy that was born in South Africa. But right after he's born, he moves to Canada. He lives in Canada for that 1971 to like 2001 era of his life. So pretty important years. So, dude, do more for Canada already. And then he goes to the States. And in the States, he creates some businesses. He creates one in California, then he moves it to Texas for tax breaks. But his companies, when he sends his rockets into space, he's using launching pads from former Soviet socialist republics, right? He goes down into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and therefore we look at him, and because he seems to speak for all of humanity, and he wants to get a presence on Mars, he might not only be the first real clear transnational person, but he might be the first transplanetary person, right? Is he from Earth? Will he be from Mars? Who is this guy? So just as corporations are blurry, what nation do you identify with? Tim Hortons, what nation do you identify with? Big Maple Leaf there, but there's a lot of Brazilian owners. What nation does he identify with? He doesn't really talk about being Canadian too often anymore, but when you look at his life, his most important years were spent here in Canada, and he even went to university. He went to more than just the University of Pennsylvania. He also went to Queens, right? He went to Queen's University. So I look at Elon Musk and I say, dude, why don't you bring the Quebec Nordique back? You're going to be worth $300 billion soon. It might cost you $1 billion to overpay for a team to move to Quebec. You're out $1 billion. You'll make that back in a week or two. Put a couple more teams in Toronto. Bring one to Saskatoon. Heck, you could put a team in Red Deer if you wanted. You lose a whole bunch of money, but Canadians would love you. Do something for us. Don't forget your roots. So, going back to it, we want you to know, what is a transnational. There's this blurring. We don't really know where you're from. Transnational corporations like Tim Hortons, they claim to be Canadian, but are they? They're a subsidiary of a Canadian holding company that is a subsidiary of a Brazilian company that has headquarters in Rio and New York. Now it's becoming a little confused. What are you? So the last thing I'd like to do today to kind of highlight what is a corporation and the idea that profit is the most important incentive, we're going to watch a quick 6-minute video, and we'll probably only watch 3 minutes of it. We're going to look at how Coca-Cola sponsored the Nazis during World War II, and then you'll get the rest of the class for your essay. So we're looking at this to just show how profit trumps everything, even allegiance during war. So during war, Coca-Cola said, we have a subsidiary in Germany. Should we be making beverages for the Germans? And they're like, yeah, we want to make some money. So they made Fanta Orange. And GM made Opel cars in Germany. And the worst part of the story will be what IBM did. IBM says we don't have a lot of customers during World War II. So when the Germans need a punch card system to keep track of the people being moved around in the Holocaust, we made them those primitive computers, these punch card machines, and we service them on site every month. So IBM directly traded with the enemy during the war and even went to these death camps and serviced the machines, keeping track of the Holocaust. This shows corporations, they're not all good.